Welcome to another edition of the untold story of the Protestant Reformation, episode 12. If you've been following along in this series and you happen to notice that my voice sounds a little different to you, it's because I'm suffering from a cold. You might have heard it coming on in the last episode. It is now a full category 5. But no worries. We are in the year 1521, and there is some pretty interesting stuff that I'm excited to tell you about that happens this year. So let's get into it. In the spring of the year 1521, the imperial diet will be held in the city of Worms or the city of Worms. The city of Worms is located southwest of Wittenberg. It's in the Duchy of Palatine, located on the Rhine River. So most of the guests that will be arriving by boat, including Martin Luther when I get to him. And the great thing about this diet is the Holy Roman Emperor, the new Holy Roman Emperor, is in attendance. He was coronated by the electors back in October of 1520, and now he is at their imperial diet in the spring of 1521. And the main topic of discussion, or the main item on the agenda, is the declaration of war against France. Francis I, the King of France, if you remember, was a candidate for the Holy Roman Emperor. He has gotten more and more aggressive with his boundaries and attacks. He, at this point, owns Milan and the territory surrounding Milan. Milan is a part of France at this point, normally a part of Italy, but Francis took that territory. Francis I will also attack Luxembourg with an army of 10,000 during the year of 1521, and Luxembourg is an area that hits home to the Holy Roman Emperor. It's where he received his dukeship, his original dukeship, so that is his home territory. Also on the agenda, Charles V wants to meet with Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther has been excommunicated. And traditionally, once a person has been excommunicated, they are handed over to the authorities to deal with them. The funny part about this is Andreas Karlstadt was excommunicated, but he was not invited to the Diet of Worms. And the Holy Roman Emperor is going to give Martin Luther a royal escort with armed horsemen and displaying the royal banner as they travel from Wittenberg down to the Diet of Worms. And many of Martin Luther's closest friends and his supporters did not want him to go to this diet because they believed he would be executed after his trial. And their concerns are valid, and they do have merit, because 100 years prior to Martin Luther's trial, there was another reformer by the name of Jan Hus who was given similar conditions. He was told he would have a royal escort and they wouldn't harm him after his trial. But at that time, Jan Hus went to the trial, he was convicted, and they burned him at the stake. So Martin Luther's supporters and friends have a valid concern about taking this trip. I will talk more about Jan Hus probably after this series is done. I'll do a lecture specifically on Jan Hus. He's very similar to Martin Luther, but anyway. So Martin Luther takes 2 of his colleagues from Wittenberg, and they get in this wagon, and they're surrounded by the horsemen, and this parade shuffles off through the towns, going down to the Diet of Worms. And what they're noticing is when the people, the commoners, see this royal parade traveling through their town, the people know exactly what's going on. Through the tavern rumors, they know that the royal emperor is at the Diet of Worms, and they also know that Martin Luther has been excommunicated and that he's going to stand trial. So they come out to greet Martin Luther, and they start to realize how many fans Martin Luther has. He is treated like a celebrity from town to town. When the royal parade reaches Erfurt, where Martin Luther, his home monastery, they supposedly brought out 60 horsemen to go out and protect the royal parade as it came into town, because there were so many people gathering on the streets to see or touch Martin Luther and yell for him to preach or give a sermon. Well, Martin Luther did give a sermon at a mass, and there were so many people packed into this church that the balcony started swaying and cracking, that the people had to jump off the balcony, and many of them jumped out of windows to save themselves from the collapsing balcony. Later, in another church, in another town that was overcrowded, the ceiling started crumbling, and large pieces of columns and rock fell to the ground on the church floor. Apparently, these were these massive boulders of the church that fell. And then after that, Martin Luther got sick, terribly sick, where they didn't think they could go on. And he started to believe that Satan was trying to stop him from getting to the Diet of Worms. And he wasn't the only one. Several people felt the same exact thing. They were feeling that this trip seemed doomed. So he wrote letters saying that Satan is trying to stop me from getting to this diet. And let's break away from this story for just a moment. And let's go back to Martin Luther being ordained as a priest back in 1507. After Martin Luther celebrated his first Mass and Eucharist, they had a dinner where all his guests came to celebrate Martin Luther's first Mass. To Martin Luther's surprise, his father, Hans Luther, was at the Mass and the celebration. The two had not spoken in 2 years since Martin Luther joined the monastery. And Martin Luther said to his father, "Dear father, what do you think of your son now?" And Hans Luther replied, "Son, have you not read in the Bible to honor thy mother and thy father? You have now left your mother and father to fend for themselves." Hans Luther was talking about joining the monastery. There will be no money provided to the family after they can't work. And Martin Luther responded back by saying, "Father, it was God's thunderous calling to me," referring to his lightning bolt experience. And Hans Luther replied by saying, "May God grant that wasn't Satan's apparition calling you." That statement would bother Martin Luther for his entire life. So think about that. But back to the cavalcade on its way down to the Diet of Worms. They get to the River Rhine, board a ship, and get to the city of Worms by boat. Upon their arrival, it caused quite the stir. One eyewitness said that more than 2,000 people gathered to catch a glimpse or to hear him speak or to touch Martin Luther. The guards surrounded Martin Luther and they barreled their way through the crowds. Another eyewitness likened this event to Jesus going into Jerusalem. The city of Worms was a city of around 7,000, but during a diet, that would double. However, knowing that the Holy Roman Emperor was there for the first time and Martin Luther, we could probably assume that the population was a little over 20,000 at this diet. Martin Luther and his companions are brought to the inn where Frederick the Wise is staying, and they go in to eat lunch with Frederick the Wise and many of Frederick the Wise's friends, such as Philip of Hesse was probably there, Frederick the Wise's younger brother John, who was also a ruler in Saxony. They were probably there, but The table was said to have 10 to 12 people, and the inn had to be closed because there was too many people trying to get in to meet Martin Luther. Meanwhile, while Martin Luther is enjoying his rock star status at another section of town, Pope Leo's people, his legates and a couple cardinals, they are complaining in letters back to Pope Leo at how poorly they are being treated at the Diet of Worms by the people. They are being yelled at with obscenities, scoffed, and spit on. What these two opposing experiences show us is just how well Frederick the Wise's propaganda campaign is working. Think about this. If you've been watching this series, back at the Diet of Augsburg, I told you that Martin Luther was essentially an obscure figure. And a year later, at the Leipzig debate, I told you he's a little more well-known, but he had to bring 200 of his own supporters to the debate. Now, we're 2 years later, we're in 1521, 2 years after Frederick the Wise getting all that money. And Martin Luther is likened that to Jesus, while members of the Catholic Church are seen as this brood of vipers and demons. Martin Luther eating lunch with Frederick the Wise and other princes is dripping with irony. As commoners gawk and try to get a glimpse through the inn windows, they don't notice that Martin Luther is eating with some of the most prominent princes throughout Germany, those who are manipulating public perception into believing that Martin Luther is a man of the people and a savior, and that those of the Catholic Church are members of Satan's army. Well, I went way over the time I wanted to spend on this and didn't cover nearly enough, so I'm going to have to do this in another lecture. But let me leave you with 2 points. Number one, many of you might know that Frederick the Wise went to his grave claiming that he never met Martin Luther face to face. We know that's a lie. Number two, Martin Luther did not stay at the inn with Frederick the Wise. He couldn't find a spot anywhere throughout Worms. He ended up having to stay at St. John's Hospital with 2 other men in one room. So that should give you an idea of what they really thought of him being a savior or likened to Jesus. No one wanted to give up their room for him. We'll do the next episode on Monday or Tuesday. Have a great weekend.